Hello and welcome to Shame to Shine. I am Steph. I am so happy to be here today with Christy Uffelman, who is a extremely radiant coach. And beyond just being radiant in her own energy, she is a reinvention coach and a #1 Amazon best-selling author and founder of Edge Leadership. And she does have a book that just came out that we'll get to in the show. So if you are really feeling Christy, which I know you will be, there will be some beautiful ways to access her work. So thank you, Christy, for coming on and welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Yes, lovely, lovely. So just as we were getting on, Christy and I were touching base on the interview, and she asked me this question, how do you define shame? And in some of the other interviews, we haven't really gone into depth on how we all define shame. And so I'm actually going to turn that around. And Christy, would love to hear from you how you define shame as then we start to get into what is the shame that you've experienced or that you've seen clients experience and turn it into the shine. But first, let's start with what is shame to you?
So I think it is a really important question because for a lot of us, we don't want to talk about shame. Even if we don't have a definition for it, there is something about it that just feels yucky in our systems. And a lot of us see it as a source of conflict where we want to, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, the different ways that we respond to conflict in our lives. And so, my definition of shame that I live and work with is not my definition. So, there is a thought leader in my space named Dr. Brene Brown. And, hopefully some people have heard of her. If you are hearing me talk about her name and you haven't heard of her yet, I'm going to invite you to Google her. Her TED Talk on vulnerability and shame is one of the most watched TED Talks on earth. In fact, last time I checked, one of the top 5 most watched TED Talks on earth, 65 million views. Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown. And I am incredibly privileged that in 2018, I was one of 50 coaches globally handpicked by Brene and her team to take her work on shame and vulnerability and empathy out of the social workspace. She's a research PhD out of Texas, out of that space, and bring it to corporations and look at it through the lens of how do we build more courageous leaders in the workplace and in the world, and how do we meet people where they are and where we spend, most of us anyway, the majority of our time of our lives at work. So, the definition that I learned from my time with Brene is making a really clear distinction of how do we build shame resilience and how do we live more courageous and authentic lives and learn to understand shame and move through it. So, the way when somebody asks me what shame is, as you just did, I usually start by describing how it is not guilt, because guilt is another very similar, it's adjacent to shame from an emotion standpoint. And most of us use those two words interchangeably. And if I'm being honest, I think, just using myself as an example, because I didn't like even the word shame because it felt yucky to me, I would lean into guilt way more. I feel guilty as a working mom, or I feel guilty that I couldn't be there for a team member when they needed me, or I couldn't be there for my brother, or I didn't show up the way that I wanted to. I would say I felt guilt. So guilt is I made a mistake. Shame is I am a mistake.
Ouch. Mhm.
So
So,
that's what shame is to me.
mhm.
Shame is that I cannot experience self-disappointment in a healthy way. And so I make myself feel less than,
Mhm.
or that, fill in the blank.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's not really a fix to it with where guilt in that definition of I made a mistake, there are ways to repair. And with shame,
Correct.
if I am a mistake, then like, what do you do with that? Of
That's
then
right.
you're kind of stuck in that feeling. And I wonder for listeners who are hearing this way of defining it for the first time, if that clicks in where like that feeling of I am a mistake, how toxic that can be for our emotional and spiritual bodies and how that may show up. So I'm wondering for you, and I would love to hear how in your own life you've navigated identifying when have you noticed, oh, I'm feeling shame, I'm feeling this sense of I am a mistake, and it's something that I want to heal from. But is there anything that you're willing to share personally with the audience on where you felt shame in your own life that you may have since overcome?
Absolutely. I mean, as a human being, I feel shame damn
Yeah.
near every day. The longer, the farther I get on this journey of what I call personal evolution,
Mhm.
the more shame resilience I have built to be able to bounce back quicker. But I don't ever anticipate that I am going to live a shame-free life. And I don't think that any of us as humans will.
Mhm.
I think it's part of what we're here on this earth to move through. And I think that we also cannot talk about shame within ourselves right now without talking about shame within the collective,
Mhm.
because the collective world is now, our country here in the United States is now coming face to face with shame, truly in super powerful ways that I know you all are aware of. But so the question was posited to me. And one other quick thing from a framing standpoint that I think is important that I want to say before I dive into some storytelling is, you had said, Steph, about, guilt is something we can, I can fix if I need to repair between two people, or if I don't show up well, I can change how I show up. So guilt is our culture doesn't look at guilt as a healthy emotion, but I see it as a healthy emotion.
Mhm.
Guilt allows me to walk in my integrity. I said something that I didn't feel good afterwards. I got into an argument with my husband Kevin and I didn't show up well. I often say I'm not a fair fighter. Like we'll get into an argument and I'll give him the cold shoulder and I'll run upstairs to my room and, give him the silent treatment because we can't repair something that I'm not willing to engage in.
Mhm.
And then I end up self-shaming because I think I know better, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
and um, I should not show up in that way, or I'm better than this, or whatever it is, and I start to go down what Brene refers to as a shame spiral.
Mhm.
So a shame spiral is when our inner critic and our negative self-talk and our self-limiting beliefs, which, maybe we'll talk about today or maybe we'll talk about another time, but how we shift shame is looking at our belief systems. How we shift guilt is looking at our behaviors.
Mhm.
That's a huge distinction there.
Mhm.
And so for me, the what I think is really important to share today, the message that I want to share is that shame occurs between you and you.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that other people can't shame us. That doesn't mean that other people haven't shamed us. I believe as humans, we have learned how to shame ourselves from being shamed by parents and grandparents and teachers and coaches and authority figures and culture and media and all of those things. But here's the beautiful part of that is that there was a time that we didn't know how to self-shame,
Mhm.
and learning how to not self-shame. It's less of a learning and more of a remembering.
Mhm.
So let me give you an example. I have the new book, called Wayfinding that I wrote and published this year and launched not too long ago. And in addition to writing the book this year, I have the privilege to partner with a great organization here in the Northeast of the United States called Sheets. And they are convenience store, gas stations, incredibly innovative organization. And they wanted to step into the space of culture change around this work and include shame resilience as a part of it. And so I have spent 2025 writing a chapter on the book, playing with the content with 100 leaders, writing a chapter of the book, playing with the content of 100 leaders. The program is a hybrid program for them that is customized to their organization. And so the launch was with 100 leaders in person. And then month 2 was virtual, now where we're breaking into 2 separate cohorts. Mm-hmm. And it's the first virtual session and my first time teaching this content with brand new leaders. And while I have been working with Sheets for the last 6 years, this is now 2 levels above the level of leader that I've been working with for the last 6 years. Okay. So I went into it with expectations. Okay. So as we think about shame, the first thing to think about is what were my expectations? And anytime as humans, we have expectations. When we fail to meet those expectations, we have judgments. Mm-hmm. And so I went into that feeling very much that I needed to prove to these senior leaders that I was competent, that I had it all together, that this content was going to be valuable. I knew that this space of human development and personal development in the professional setting was very unlike anything that they had ever seen before. You know, they're used to leadership development as conflict negotiation or all of this. And I'm coming in and saying, how we lead others starts with how we lead ourselves, because who we are is how we lead. And so all of these expectations on myself that I needed to prove, to perfect, and to perform, if I'm being honest. You know, when I am in that space of avoiding shame, I often, puff up, and I have a name for her, and I call her Corporate Christy. And so I log on 20 minutes early, like I always do, to Zoom to make sure everything's rolling. And, it's quarter till and nobody arrives, and it's 10 till and nobody arrives. And I start to get, because expectations are high. So already my anxiety and these feelings of not being good enough are starting to rise. And at the core, that's what shame is I'm not good enough. Yeah. Right. I'm not a good enough mother. I'm not a good enough partner. I'm not a good enough citizen of the world. I'm not a good enough coach. And then at about, 6 minutes till, somebody pops in, and she's a graduate of my past program at the company. And so I'm like, all right, everything's okay. She's here. And we start talking. And the next thing I know, it's 2 minutes after the hour and there's nobody else on the call. Huh. And I start panicking, and I'm texting, my contacts in HR, what's going on? And here, 48 other people, Zoom, placed in a totally different room. And they're all just sitting there waiting for me. And me and the other person are over here. Yeah. And I can feel, so, when we think about shame, part of shame resilience is understanding how shame starts to show up in your body. And when I first started this journey, 2018, maybe 2016, when I started to become familiar with Brené's work and, studying her work, is when I started to first learn about shame. Back then, I didn't realize I was in shame until I was all the way through the cycle and beating myself up mercilessly for not being good enough. Mm-hmm. And now, and why I think this story is so important, is because I had awareness of how shame was starting to show up in my body. I could feel the heat rising. Mm-hmm. I could feel my fingers tingling. I could start to feel my heartbeat in my chest. Mm-hmm. And if I don't check shame then it moves for me, and it's different for everybody. It moves up in my body, and my brain starts to get foggy as my amygdala takes over and my frontal cortex shuts down. And then I'm not thinking as clearly. And then I have a tendency to make lots of little mistakes. And so in that moment, I was able to look at my partner in crime and say, we're both in a different room than everyone else. So let's jump out and let's try to log back on. And so as I am calming myself down, I'm jumping off to log back on. And wouldn't you know it, the universe in its infinite wisdom is like, and just going to continue this lesson for you a little bit more, Christy, because Zoom has an update. And right now, we're going to give you that update. So it is by the time I finally log on with these 50 leaders, some of whom, logged on 10 minutes early, because that's what a lot of responsible adults do for something like this, have now been sitting for almost 30 minutes waiting for me by the time I get into that room. And I am trying to not be beside myself, but I am beside myself because all of those old patterns, all of those old habits, all of those old voices are coming back online. That I'm going to look stupid and that I'm most of all going to look incompetent. And if you know me, one of the worst fears for me professionally is to not look competent. I have a belief system that I am only worthy when I bring value to you, and I was not bringing value. And as I stepped into that space, I took a deep breath and I shared with everybody, of course I apologized. And I said, we're going to trust that this is going to unfold as it's meant to. I thank you for the grace, and I jump in. We end up, it's a 2.5-hour session. As we get close to the end of the session, I close with joking with everybody, thanking them again for the grace, and then saying that I don't think that it was an accident, that the universe, the good Lord, whatever it is that you believe, put me in the position today to actually show you what I'm going to teach you in this program this year. And so it wasn't what I said there. What is important in this story is what I did afterwards. Okay, so shame resilience for me means plugging back into my own energy and plugging back into the things that serve me and keep me out of that spiral. So the old me would have ruminated on that. Definitely the rest of the day, probably for weeks afterwards. It would have gotten in the way of how I showed up with other clients. It absolutely would have gotten in the way of showing up for them the next month. And I would have ended up shaming myself. So, if you think about shame, as far as we know, anyway, humans are the only animal that punishes ourselves multiple times for the same mistake. The squirrel in the backyard goes, makes a mistake and is like, oh, okay, won't do that again. And that's it. But we replay things over and over, sometimes for days, sometimes for hours, sometimes for decades. And so what I have found to reset myself when I'm in a moment of shame is two things. The first is empathy. And so what I did was I called my husband, Kevin, and I shared how I was feeling. Shame cannot survive when there is empathy in play, but that requires us to talk about it with someone who has earned the right to hear it. And the second thing that I did was I went and I moved my body. For me, I need to move the unwanted energy that shame generated out of my body, because if I don't, it stays there. I needed to convert it into something. So that was a Pilates class. So I went to a Pilates class to recognize that I was carrying things that did not serve me to carry. And what did that look like to move it through my body? Now, was it completely gone? No. Did I feel a hell of a lot better? Yeah.
That is a really incredible story, and there are so many layers to it that are really important lessons and that are themes throughout this series. And something that you just started touching on was this idea of moving the energy and the whole like one of the theories that has even prompted this series is that if we go with energy can't be created or destroyed, energy is energy, and we do have shame energy that shows up in the body. You described some physical sensations that you feel that travel up and get into your brain and cause fogginess. And there's some similarities of what we all feel, but everyone has their own expression. But like it doesn't feel good. We know that
Doesn't
for
feel good.
sure. And yet it is possible to shift it. And so you brought up two things, empathy and movement, that help to shift kind of the belief system as well as how the energy is in your body. And so then the theory is as we shift it through these micro events and then even through like big picture events of a story of I'm not good enough, being able to shift that can make that shame energy potentially be a magnet for positivity. Or for, if we don't want to get too much into toxic positivity, it can become a magnet for community building or even for having, in this case, content to teach your clients or being able to show your client this is what we're going to talk through over the next year. And so I'm curious from this story and even from what you have experienced as a reinvention coach and from your expertise in this shame resilience arena, how how does that transition show up for you of like, can shame energy, instead of needing to be cut away, where we might deal with it by being like, I just want that to be gone. I want to erase it from my memory. I want no one to know that it happened. That like instead of getting into that phase of can I get rid of it, that really alchemizing it can make it become a source of something else, like creative expression or teaching. So is that theory in general, does that track with what you've experienced here and with your clients?
So for me, um, so I do believe that energy is energy and it is neither created or destroyed. And I am still very new to this. I'm what am I, 3 years into my journey around learning about energy and moving through Reiki 1, 2, and my master's level. And I've been working for 7 years in this space of understanding the spirit behind the body
Mm,
and what that looks like and how that shows up.
mhm,
So I will say that as, kind of a precursor to thank you for the grace, and that I'm still learning the words that may or may not resonate with your audience, with how I'm about to answer this question. Um, so I would say when I first learned about shame and how I understand that Brene talks about shame is that it is about releasing
mm,
unwanted energy, and that we create this and then we need to release it. What I am in this space of practicing in the language that I would use in my own research and in my own experience is that it is about evolving
mm,
it.
mm,
And so my new book, Wayfinding, is about coming back home to yourself.
mm,
And so to me, when I'm at my worst in shame, I am sitting in judgment of myself and
mm,
I am not accepting that I am a human being and I am going to always make mistakes and
mhm,
I am going to always show up less than what my expectation and ideals are because I have created this image of what I should be.
right.
And so for me, this concept of evolution, I can't talk about that without also talking about our belief systems
Mhm,
because the how I process and move through shame and evolve through it is by accepting it and sitting with it and understanding what it's here to tell me,
Mm.
and then recognizing where I am on my path of evolution and where I can take it from there.
Gorgeous, gorgeous. And I'm so happy you brought up wayfinding because there are a lot of these types of tools. And for those listening, you have just beautiful ways of taking these 5D concepts and communicating them in the 3D in simple ways that make sense. Not in ways that are like, I should have known that, but just in ways that are like, oh, that is really helpful for getting to take the next step. So we will have all those links in on wherever you're watching. And here is the book, Wayfinding.
Here
So
it
what
is. I'm
else? What
so
else?
proud of it.
Oh, and I've gotten a sneak peek and it's truly fantastic. So any final words that you'd like to share about what people can expect when they check out the Wayfinding book and then after that, so any final words for Wayfinding and then for you in general that you want to share?
Final words for wayfinding. Um, the book Wayfinding was supposed to be published 3 years ago. And then it was supposed to be published 18 months ago. And 18 months ago, my publisher said, Christy, we're putting you and the project on ice because for whatever reason, you can't get it together to get this done. And I intentionally sat with trusting that it wasn't ready to be born yet.
Mm.
And I don't think that it wasn't ready to be born yet because I didn't have the words for it. It wasn't ready to be born yet because the world wasn't ready for it. But it is now. And you know it, and I know it. And somebody asked me on book launch day, who was the audience that I wrote the book for? And I laughed and I said, I'm not entirely sure, quite frankly. My first two books were leadership books. And it was, this very particular audience. And, I was a leadership coach for 12 years. And now, granted, I knew on the back end, my version of leadership was very different than my competitors.
Yeah.
Right. I always talk about growing the person to grow the leader, the internal source from where our external behaviors were born, because who we are is how we lead. And I hid that underneath the guise of leadership because I thought that's what companies wanted. And I thought that's what was going to sell. And that was what was going to make me a successful business. Truly that.
Right.
And that's why this book was so different is it's 50% memoir.
Mm.
It's my stories, my experience, because I think as humans, for eons, we have learned through story.
Yeah.
And so it's my journey of my evolution, moving through self-awareness. Who am I really and what matters to me? What are my core values? Who is my favorite self? How can I walk in self-alignment and my authenticity? And that raises my frequency of energy, which impacts everybody around me, right? The more I know myself, the more I can walk in self-alignment. The more I walk in alignment consistently, the more self-trust I build. The more I prioritize myself as much as I prioritize other people. When I learn how to set and sustain boundaries with myself as well as others, when I understand my inner critic and that if I can hear the voice, I'm not the voice. Mm-hmm. And how to be a witness to that and how that plays into self-shaming and to build shame resilience. And then to move through, the more I show up and prove that I am dependable to myself, the more self-worth I have. The more self-worth I have, the more I can honor the human experience of shame, transmute that energy into whatever does and will serve both me and the world. And I used to think that it was a linear process, right? The more awareness I had, the more I could walk in self alignment, the more I walk in my authenticity, the more self trust I build, the more self trust I have, the more self worth I had. And then I had the realization it's not a linear process, it's a circle.
Mhm.
Because the deeper my sense of self worth, the greater self awareness, the more the self alignment. And then I realized it's a spiral. As
Mm.
you all know, that I and my 3D compartment, folks, we are just still learning. That's my work to do, to bring this to them. So like that space
Mm.
of, yes, you're going to feel shame. No, that doesn't make you bad, and it
Mm.
doesn't make you broken.
Mm.
That it is a part of our evolution. And so that's what I would say about wayfinding. I thank you if you choose to purchase the book. I doubly thank you if you choose to write a review, because I have done what I could do to bring it to the world. And now I am trusting that the folks that are meant to find it will find it. So circling back to, I had a very particular audience for the first two books. I intentionally don't for this one.
Mm.
I am waiting for the audience to find the book and tell me who it's written for,
Mm.
because this is a human journey
Yeah.
and it is time. And the final thing that I would say that I would leave all of you with around the concept of shame, and I talk about this in the book, and this is, I want to be super clear, while I have it in the book, these are not my words.
Okay.
These are words that were channeled by a complete stranger
Mm.
to me at a solstice retreat in June of this year as I was in the throes of writing the book.
Okay.
So, and those words are that I will leave you with is, I begin again, not because I failed, but because I am worth returning to. I
Whoa.
begin again, not because I failed, but because I am worth returning to.
That is something to put on your screensaver, on your fridge. So thank you, Christy, for sharing your radiance and your story and your ideas and your beautiful way of expressing it here. So grateful for your time. And please, audience, check out the Wayfinding book. You are going to love it. Take care.
Thank you very much. So long, everybody.